The blood on her apron had turned brown in the Montana summer heat, and Harriet Merrick's hands moved mechanically over the empty cradle, rocking it with a rhythm that spoke of Bones' deep exhaustion and a grief too large to hold inside her small frame. Kade O'Brien had been riding for 3 days straight when he came upon the weathered farmhouse outside Deer Lodge, Montana, seeking only water for his horse and maybe a meal if the owners were charitable. But what he found in that dusty yard made him pull his gelding to a halt so sudden, the animal whinnied in protest. The woman sat on the porch in a battered rocking chair, her dark hair falling from its pins, her green eyes fixed on nothing at all while her hands pushed that cradle back and forth, and there was no baby's cry to answer her efforts. Kade dismounted slowly, his spurs jingling in the quiet afternoon air. It was late July in the year 1879, and the sun beat down mercilessly on the parched Montana landscape. He'd seen grief before, had worn it himself after losing his parents to cholera when he was barely 20. But there was something about the hollow look in this woman's eyes that made his chest tighten. He approached the porch with careful steps, the way one might approach a spooked horse, and when she didn't acknowledge his presence, he cleared his throat gently. "Madam," he said, his voice rough from days without much conversation, "I'm sorry to intrude." Her hand stilled on the cradle. For a long moment she didn't speak, didn't even look at him, and he thought perhaps she hadn't heard. Then her lips moved, forming words so soft he had to lean closer to catch them. "They're sleeping," she whispered. "I mustn't wake them." Kade felt his throat close up. He glanced at the cradle and saw what he'd suspected from the first moment. It was empty save for a worn blanket, faded blue and stitched with careful hands. He looked back at the woman, taking in the bloodstains on her dress, the way her fingers trembled even though they gripped the cradle's edge, and he made a decision that would change both their lives forever. Without asking permission, he climbed the 3 steps to the porch and settled himself on the weathered boards beside her chair. The wood was warm through his dusty pants, and up close he could see she was younger than he'd first thought, maybe 23 or 24, with a face that would have been beautiful if not for the devastation written across it. He was 26 himself, old enough to know that sometimes the only thing you could do for another person's pain was sit with it. "Tell me about them," he said quietly. Her head turned toward him for the first time, and he saw tears tracking through the dust on her cheeks. "What?" "Your babies," he said, because he could see now that the cradle was large enough for twins, could see the 2 sets of tiny gowns hanging on the clothesline behind the house. "Tell me about them." Something cracked in her expression, like ice breaking up on a river in spring. Her mouth opened, closed, and then she was sobbing, great wrenching sounds that seemed to tear themselves from somewhere deep inside her. Kade didn't move to touch her, sensing that she needed this release, but he stayed beside her, solid and present while she fell apart. When the worst of it passed, she wiped her face with shaking hands and stared out at the empty horizon. "Emma and Elijah," she said, her voice raw. "They were born 3 weeks ago. Perfect, so perfect. Emma had my eyes and Elijah had his father's chin." "Had," Kade repeated softly, acknowledging the past tense. She nodded, fresh tears spilling over. "The fever came 5 days after they were born. I tried everything. Cold cloths, feverfew tea, prayers. Nothing worked. They died within hours of each other 2 days ago." She drew in a shuddering breath. "My husband Thomas, he went to fetch the doctor from town, but he was already treating an outbreak of scarlet fever. By the time Thomas got back with the preacher instead, they were gone. Where's your husband now?" Kade asked, though he had a sinking feeling he knew the answer. "He buried them yesterday morning, out under the cottonwood tree where we used to sit in the evenings and talk about what we'd name them. what they'd be when they grew up. Her voice was eerily calm now, shock settling in. Then he saddled his horse and rode into Deer Lodge. Said he couldn't stand to be here anymore, couldn't stand to look at me and remember what we'd lost. He hasn't come back. Kade felt anger kindle in his chest, hot and righteous. What kind of man abandoned his wife in her darkest hour? But he kept his voice level. "How long since you've eaten?" She blinked at him as if he'd asked her to solve a complex mathematical equation. "I don't know. Yesterday, the day before." He stood, making his decision. "I'm going to tend to my horse and then I'm going to make you something to eat. You're going to stop rocking that cradle and come inside." "I can't," she whispered. If I go inside, then it's real. Then they're really gone." Kade crouched beside her chair so they were eye to eye. He had dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of whiskey, and there was something steady in his gaze that made her focus on him instead of the abyss of her grief. "They're already gone, madam, and I'm real sorry about that, sorrier than I can say. But you're still here, and you need to eat something before you collapse. Can you do that for me?" She stared at him for a long moment, this stranger who'd appeared out of nowhere with his dusty clothes and kind eyes. Then, slowly, she nodded. Her name was Harriet, she told him as he helped her to her feet. Harriet Merrick, though she'd been born Harriet Miller in a little town in Ohio before she'd met Thomas and followed him west with stars in her eyes and hope in her heart. She swayed when she stood, and Kade kept a careful hand on her elbow as he guided her into the house. The interior was neat despite everything, the kind of home a woman takes pride in. There was a kitchen with a cast iron stove, a small parlor with a settee and 2 chairs, and 2 bedrooms visible through open doorways. Kade settled Harriet at the kitchen table, and then went back out to tend to his horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Whiskey, who'd carried him faithfully from Wyoming where his last ranch job had ended. When he returned to the house, Harriet was sitting exactly where he'd left her, staring at her hands. Kade found eggs in the cold cellar, bread in a tin box, some butter that hadn't gone completely rancid in the heat. He wasn't much of a cook, but he could manage scrambled eggs and toast, and he did so while she watched him with hollow eyes. "You should eat," he said, setting a plate in front of her. "I'm not hungry. Eat anyway." She picked up the fork with trembling fingers and managed a few bites. Color started to return to her face, though whether from the food or simply from being inside, away from that empty cradle, he couldn't tell. "Why are you being kind to me?" she asked suddenly. "You don't know me." Kade considered the question while he ate his own portion standing up by the stove. "My mama used to say that kindness doesn't require acquaintance. Besides, I know what it's like to lose people. Not children," he added quickly, seeing her flinch, "but my parents when I was 20, it about killed me. If it hadn't been for my older brother staying with me through those first weeks, I don't know what I would have done." "Where's your brother now?" "California. Found gold and married a saloon girl. Last letter I got, they had a baby girl of their own." He smiled slightly. "Seems fitting somehow that he got his happy ending." "And you? What's your ending?" Kade shrugged. "Still being written, I suppose. I've been working ranches these past 6 years, saving money, learning the business. Figure someday I'll have my own spread, though the way land prices are climbing, that day seems further off than it used to." They fell into silence, but it was a more comfortable one than before. After Harriet had eaten what she could, Kade cleared the plates and then asked her where the well was. He spent the next hour hauling water, enough to fill the big copper tub he found in the bathing room. While the water heated on the stove, he went back outside and brought in his saddlebags. "You should clean up," he told Harriet. "Get out of that dress. It'll help, I promise." She looked down at herself as if seeing the bloodstains for the first time, her face crumpled. "Their blood, from the birth. I haven't had the strength to wash it." "Then let me help. You bathe and I'll take care of the laundry." It was wildly improper, of course, for a strange man to be in a married woman's house, handling her intimate garments, but propriety seemed like a small concern in the face of such raw grief. Harriet disappeared into the bathing room while Kade stripped the bed linens, gathered the blood-stained clothing, and started the laborious process of washing everything in the big tub outside once Harriet was done bathing. By the time evening fell, the house was cleaner. Harriet was dressed in fresh clothing, her hair braided down her back, and Kade had made a simple dinner of beans and salt pork. They ate together at the small kitchen table, and though Harriet still looked like a ghost of herself, there was at least some life returning to her eyes. "I should go into town tomorrow," she said quietly. "Try to find Thomas." "You want to find him?" Kade asked, perhaps more bluntly than he should have. She was quiet for a long time. "I don't know," she admitted finally. "Part of me wants him to come home to grieve with me the way a husband should, but another part of me is so angry I can barely breathe. He left me. We lost our babies and he just left. Grief makes people do strange things," Kade offered, though privately he thought that was a generous interpretation. "What would you have done? If you'd had a wife and lost children," he met her eyes across the table. "I'd have held her. I'd have cried with her. I'd have stayed, no matter how much it hurt, because that's what you do when you love someone. You don't run from the pain, you walk through it together." Something shifted in Harriet's expression, a dawning realization that perhaps her marriage hadn't been what she'd believed it to be. "We married quickly," she said softly. "I was 18, he was 25. He was handsome and charming, and he said all the right things. My parents warned me it was too fast, but I didn't listen. I thought it was romantic," she laughed bitterly. "It took me coming west to realize that romance and love aren't the same thing." "No," Kade agreed. "They're not." That night, Kade insisted on sleeping on the settee in the parlor despite Harriet's protests. He wasn't about to leave her alone in this house with her grief, not when he'd seen the look in her eyes that afternoon. He'd seen that look before, on a fellow ranch hand who'd lost his brother in a stampede. 3 days after the funeral, they'd found the man in the barn, hanging from a rafter. Kade wasn't going to let that happen to Harriet. He woke several times during the night to the sound of her crying in her bedroom, great wrenching sobs that tore at his heart. But each time, he forced himself to stay where he was, knowing she needed to release the grief in her own way. Only once did he get up when he heard her stumbling around and feared she might harm herself, but she was only getting water from the kitchen pump. She startled when she saw him. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to wake you." "You didn't." "Well, you did, but it's fine. Are you all right?" She shook her head slowly. "No, but I will be, someday, maybe." "You will," he said with a certainty he didn't entirely feel. "It won't ever stop hurting completely, but it'll get easier to bear. I promise you that." She studied him in the moonlight coming through the kitchen window. "Why are you doing this? Really? You could have ridden on, found somewhere else to stay." Kade considered the question. The truth was, he didn't entirely know himself. Yes, he was a decent man who couldn't in good conscience leave a grieving woman alone. But there was something more, something about Harriet that called to him in a way he didn't fully understand. Even with her face ravaged by tears and her eyes red from crying, he found her beautiful. More than that, he found her compelling. There was a strength in her that hadn't been broken by tragedy, only bent. He could see it in the way she'd forced herself to eat dinner, in the way she'd gotten out of that chair and left the cradle behind. She was fighting to survive, even when part of her wanted to give up. "Because you needed help," he said simply. "And because I couldn't ride away." She nodded slowly, as if that answer satisfied her, and went back to bed. Kade returned to the settee, but sleep was a long time coming. The next morning they rode into Deer Lodge together. The town was larger than Kade had expected. A prosperous settlement that had grown up around the territorial prison and the mining operations in the surrounding hills. Main Street was lined with businesses. A general store, a saloon, a hotel, a bank, a doctor's office, and various other establishments catering to the miners, ranchers, and settlers who called this corner of Montana home. Harriet sat straight in the saddle of her mare, a pretty chestnut named Cinnamon, but Kade could see the tension in her shoulders as they navigated the busy street. He'd saddled both horses that morning while she'd forced down some breakfast, and he'd been relieved when she hadn't argued about him accompanying her. She needed someone with her for this, whether she admitted it or not. They found Thomas Merrick in the saloon, drunk at 10 in the morning and playing cards with 3 other men who looked equally inebriated. He was a tall man with sandy hair and handsome features that were currently slack with alcohol. When he saw Harriet standing in the doorway with Kade behind her, his face went through a series of expressions: surprise, shame, anger, and finally a kind of sullen defiance. "Harriet," he said, his words slurring, "what are you doing here?" "I came to find my husband," she said, her voice steady despite the way her hands clenched at her sides. "The man who promised to love me in sickness and in health, for better or worse. Do you remember making those vows, Thomas?" He flushed, anger winning out. "Don't you dare judge me. You don't know what it's been like." "I don't know." Her voice rose, drawing the attention of everyone in the saloon. "I carried those babies for 9 months. I gave birth to them, held them while they died. I'm the one who washed their tiny bodies and dressed them for burial. And you ran away like a coward." Thomas lurched to his feet, swaying. "They were my children too." "Then act like their father," Harriet's voice cracked. "Come home, grieve with me, be my husband instead of hiding in a bottle." For a moment, Kade thought Thomas might actually do it. He saw the man's face soften, saw something like regret flash across his features. But then Thomas's gaze shifted to Kade and his expression hardened. "Who's that?" he demanded. "Who's the cowboy?" "His name is Kade O'Brien," Harriet said. "He stopped at our farm yesterday, and when he found me alone and grieving, he stayed to help. He's been more of a husband to me in 1 day than you've been in a year." It was the wrong thing to say, even if it was true. Thomas's face went purple with rage and he started toward them, but Kade was faster. He stepped in front of Harriet, his hand hovering near the colt at his hip, and his eyes had gone cold. "That's far enough," Kade said quietly. Thomas stopped, something in Kade's stance warning him that this was a man who knew how to handle himself. "That's my wife," he said. "Then you should have treated her like one." They stared at each other for a long moment, the saloon gone deathly quiet. Then Thomas laughed, a bitter sound. "You can have her," he said. "She's barren anyway. What use is a wife who can't keep babies alive?" Harriet made a small, wounded sound, and Kade's fist connected with Thomas's jaw before he'd even made the conscious decision to throw the punch. The other man went down hard, blood spurting from his split lip. The card players scrambled back, but no one moved to help Thomas up. "You're not worth the dirt on her boots," Kade said, his voice deadly calm despite the rage coursing through him. He turned to Harriet, whose face had gone white. "Let's go." They were halfway to the door when Thomas called out, his words thick and slurred. "I want a divorce. You hear me, Harriet? I'm filing for divorce." Harriet paused, her hand on the doorframe. For a moment, Kade thought she might turn back, might try to salvage something from the wreckage of her marriage. But then she straightened her shoulders and walked out into the morning sun without a backward glance. Kade followed, letting the saloon doors swing shut behind them. They didn't speak until they'd mounted their horses and ridden to the edge of town. There, Harriet finally pulled Cinnamon to a halt and turned to look at Cade, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Thank you," she said. "I shouldn't have hit him. That only made things worse." She shook her head. "No, he needed hitting, and I needed to see that someone would defend me, that I was worth defending." She drew in a shaky breath. "He was right about one thing, though. I am barren. The doctor said after Emma and Elijah were born that I'd probably never have children again. Something tore during the birth, something that couldn't be fixed." "That doesn't make you any less of a woman," Cade said fiercely. "And it sure as hell doesn't make you worth less as a person. Doesn't it? What use is a woman in this world if she can't have children? What use?" Cade shook his head in disbelief. "Harriet, there's 1,000 things that make a person valuable beyond their ability to reproduce. Your kindness, your strength, your intelligence, your humor when you're not drowning in grief. You're not less because of what happened. You're just you, and that's enough." She stared at him for a long moment, and then, unexpectedly, she smiled. It was a small, fragile thing, like a flower pushing up through snow, but it was genuine. "You're a strange man, Kade O'Brien. I've been called worse." They rode back to the farm in companionable silence. When they arrived, Cade helped Harriet down from her horse and then tended to both animals while she went inside. He found her in the kitchen a while later, staring at a letter that had been slipped under the door. "What is it?" he asked. She handed it to him wordlessly. It was from the bank, informing Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Merrick that their mortgage payment was overdue and they had 30 days to bring their account current or face foreclosure. Cade looked at the date on the letter and realized it had been written 3 weeks ago, before the babies were born. "We've been behind for months," Harriet said dully. "Thomas kept saying he'd get the money, that he had a business deal coming through. I think now that was just another lie." Cade studied the letter, doing calculations in his head. "How much do you owe?" $200. He whistled low. It was a significant sum, more than most ranch hands made in a year. "Do you have anything you could sell?" "Not enough. The livestock is worth maybe $50. The furniture and household goods another $30 if we're lucky. The land itself is mortgaged, so I can't sell that without paying off the debt first." She laughed without humor. "It's almost funny. I lose my babies, my husband, and now I'm going to lose my home too." "No," Cade said firmly. "You're not." She looked at him with tired eyes. "What choice do I have?" He'd been thinking about this all morning, ever since he'd hit Thomas Merrick and realized he wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. He'd been thinking about it even before that, if he was honest, since the moment he'd sat down beside her on that porch and asked her to tell him about her babies. He'd been thinking about it because somewhere in the past 24 hours, he'd started to care about this woman in a way that went beyond simple human compassion. "Marry me," he said. Harriet blinked. "What? Marry me? Once your divorce is final, I mean." "I've got $800 saved up from 6 years of ranch work. It's supposed to be for my own land someday, but I can't think of a better use for it than helping you keep yours. We'll pay off the mortgage, fix up the place, make it profitable. And you won't have to face any of this alone." She was staring at him like he'd sprouted a second head. "You're proposing to me. You've known me for 1 day." 24 hours, actually," he said, trying for levity. "And I know it's insane. But here's what I figure. You need help and I need a purpose. You've got land and I've got the skills to work it. We're both alone in the world, both trying to figure out what comes next. Why not figure it out together?" "But you don't love me." Cade met her eyes steadily. "No, not yet, but I could. I think I already might be starting to, if I'm honest. And I think you're the kind of woman who deserves to be loved properly, not the way Thomas Merrick loved you, which wasn't love at all. I'm willing to bet we could build something real here if you're willing to try." Harriet sank into a chair, her mind clearly reeling. "This is crazy." "Probably," he agreed. "But is it any crazier than the alternative? You lose the farm, you have nowhere to go, no money, no way to support yourself. What then? You move back to Ohio and live with your parents, take in sewing, marry whoever will have you." He crouched beside her chair. "I'm offering you a partnership, Harriet. A real one. I won't run when things get hard. I won't blame you for things beyond your control. And I'll work every day to make you happy, or at least as happy as you can be after everything you've been through." She looked at him for a long moment, searching his face. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why would you do this?" "Because when I saw you rocking that empty cradle yesterday, something in my chest cracked open. Because I sat beside you and asked you to tell me about your babies, and you did. And I saw your strength and your pain and your determination to keep breathing even when every breath hurt. Because I think you're remarkable, Harriet Merrick, and I want the chance to know you better. To build a life with you if you'll let me." Tears were streaming down her face now. "I can't promise I'll love you. I'm not asking for promises. I'm just asking for a chance." She nodded slowly and then more firmly. "All right. Yes, when the divorce is final, I'll marry you." Kade felt something ease in his chest that he hadn't realized was tight. He took her hand, squeezed it gently. "Then we've got work to do." The next weeks were a strange sort of limbo. Thomas never returned to the farm, which was both a relief and a complication. Kade moved his things into the barn, maintaining propriety even though they both knew the town was already talking. A cowboy living on a married woman's farm, helping her with the work, the two of them riding into town together for supplies. It was scandalous, and they both knew it. But Kade didn't care about scandal, and Harriet seemed beyond caring about much of anything except surviving one day at a time. He worked from dawn until dusk, mending fences, tending the small herd of cattle, planting a late summer garden that might give them vegetables come fall. Harriet worked alongside him when she could, though some days the grief was too heavy and she could barely leave her bed. On those days, Kade brought her meals and sat with her, not saying anything, just being present. Slowly, painfully, she began to heal. It wasn't a straight path. There were setbacks and bad days and nights when he woke to the sound of her crying. But there were good moments, too. The first time she laughed at one of his terrible jokes. The evening they sat on the porch together, watching the sun set over the mountains, and she leaned her head on his shoulder. The morning he found her in the garden, her hands in the dirt, actually humming while she worked. 6 weeks after Kade's arrival, the divorce papers came through. Thomas had filed in Deer Lodge, claiming abandonment and incompatibility, and because Harriet didn't contest it, the judge had granted the petition quickly. She held the papers in her hands, staring at the legal end of her marriage, and Kade watched her carefully, trying to gauge her feelings. "Are you all right?" he asked. She nodded slowly. "I think I am. Is that terrible? I was married to him for 6 years, and all I feel is relief." "That's not terrible, that's honest." She looked up at him. "Do you still want to marry me?" "You've had time to think about it, to see what a mess you'd be getting into. I wouldn't blame you if you changed your mind." Kade crossed the room and took the papers from her hands, setting them aside. Then he cupped her face in his palms, rough and calloused from work. "I haven't changed my mind." "Have you?" "No," she whispered. "But I need you to know something. I'm not the same person I was before. The grief, losing the babies, it's changed me. I don't know if I'll ever be truly whole again." "None of us are truly whole," Kade said. "We're all broken in one way or another. But maybe 2 broken people can make something beautiful together." They were married 3 days later in the parlor of the Lutheran minister's home in Deer Lodge, with the minister's wife and the town doctor as witnesses. Harriet wore a simple dress of pale blue, her dark hair pinned up, and Cade wore the one good suit he owned, brushed clean for the occasion. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Cade kissed her gently, a chaste press of lips that still managed to make Harriet's heart skip. That night, Cade moved his things from the barn into the house, into the room that had been Thomas's. He didn't presume anything else, didn't push for intimacy that Harriet clearly wasn't ready for. They were married, yes, but he'd meant what he said about partnership. He would let her set the pace. It was 2 weeks before she came to him. He was sitting on the porch in the evening, mending a bridle by lamplight, when she emerged from the house and sat beside him. She didn't say anything for a while, just sat there in her nightgown and wrapper, her bare feet tucked up under her. "I've been thinking," she said finally, about us, about this marriage. You've been so patient with me, Cade, so kind, but we can't keep living like polite strangers in the same house forever." He set down the bridle, giving her his full attention. "I told you I'll wait as long as you need. I know, but I don't think waiting is what I need anymore. I think what I need is to start living again, really living, not just surviving." She turned to look at him, her green eyes steady in the lamplight. "I want to be your wife, Cade, truly your wife." His breath caught. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure. I've been watching you these past weeks, seeing how you work so hard for us, for our future. How you're patient with me on bad days and celebratory on good ones. How you look at me like I'm something precious instead of something broken. And I've been feeling things I didn't expect to feel, not so soon after everything. I think I'm falling in love with you, and I don't want to waste any more time being afraid." Cade reached out and took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "I am in love with you," he said quietly. "I think I've been since that first day, though I didn't realize it then. You're the strongest, most beautiful person I've ever known, Harriet O'Brien." She smiled at the use of her new name, and then she leaned in and kissed him. This kiss was different from the one at their wedding, deeper and full of promise. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Cade stood and offered her his hand. "Come to bed," he said simply. She took his hand and let him lead her inside to the room they would now share. What happened there was tender and sweet and occasionally fumbling, as first times often are, but it was theirs, and that made it perfect. Afterward, lying in the darkness with Harriet's head on his chest and her breath warm against his skin, Cade felt something he hadn't felt in years, complete contentment. "Thank you," Harriet murmured sleepily. "For what?" "For sitting beside me that day, for asking about them, for staying." He kissed the top of her head. "I'll always stay." And he meant it. The seasons changed, summer giving way to autumn and then to winter. They paid off the mortgage with Cade's savings and lived carefully on what the farm produced. It wasn't an easy life, but it was a good one. They worked together during the day and fell into each other's arms at night, learning each other's bodies and hearts with equal dedication. Harriet never forgot Emma and Elijah. There were still days when the grief struck her hard, when she had to go sit under the cottonwood tree where they were buried and cry. But those days came less frequently as time passed, and Cade was always there when she needed him, holding her or giving her space as required. In the spring of 1880, they acquired more cattle and started building up their herd. Cade proved to have a gift for ranching, and under his management, the farm began to prosper. They hired a hand to help with the heavier work, a young man named Pete who was good with horses and didn't ask too many questions about their unusual courtship. It was a warm June evening when Harriet realized something was different. She'd been feeling strange for weeks, tired and queasy in the mornings, but she'd attributed it to a stomach ailment. Only when she counted back the weeks since her last monthly courses did she allow herself to hope, and even then, She was terrified to believe it. She didn't tell Kade immediately. The memory of losing Emma and Elijah was still too fresh, the fear of losing another child too overwhelming. But he noticed anyway. Of course he did. He noticed everything about her. "You've been quiet lately," he said one evening as they sat on the porch together, watching the fireflies dance in the gathering dusk. "Is something wrong?" Harriet took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I think I might be pregnant." Kade went very still. "You think?" "I'm not certain. It could be nothing. The doctor said it was unlikely I'd ever conceive again after what happened." He turned to face her fully, his whiskey eyes searching her face. "How do you feel about that? If it's true—" "Terrified," she admitted. "I'm so afraid something will go wrong again that I'll lose this baby too. I don't know if I could survive that, Kade." He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. "If you're pregnant, and if something happens, we'll survive it together. You won't be alone this time, I promise you that. And if everything goes right, if I have a healthy baby," she felt him smile against her hair, "then we'll have a family, and I'll be the luckiest man in Montana." Dr. Clausen confirmed it 2 weeks later. Harriet was approximately 3 months pregnant, due to deliver in early January of 1881. The doctor was cautious, warning them that given Harriet's history, this pregnancy would be considered high risk. But he saw no immediate cause for concern, and he promised to check on her regularly. The months that followed were both wonderful and terrifying. Kade became almost comically protective, insisting that Harriet rest frequently, that she not lift anything heavy, that she eat properly. She tolerated his fussing with good humor most of the time, though occasionally she had to remind him that she was pregnant, not made of glass. As her belly swelled, she found herself thinking often of Emma and Elijah. Would they have had dark hair like her, or light hair like their father? Would they have been quiet babies or fussy ones? She mourned again for what she'd lost, but this time the mourning was gentler, tinged with hope instead of despair. This baby wouldn't replace Emma and Elijah. Nothing could. But perhaps there was room in her heart for both grief and joy. On a frigid January night, when the Montana wind howled outside and snow piled deep against the windows, Harriet's labor began. Dr. Clausen had moved into the house 3 days earlier, sensing the baby would come soon, and he was ready when her water broke. Kade was less ready, pacing the kitchen like a caged animal while the doctor and Mrs. Clausen, who served as midwife, attended to Harriet in the bedroom. The labor was long and difficult. Harriet's screams echoed through the house, each one making Kade flinch as if he'd been struck. He wanted to be with her, wanted to hold her hand and help her through it, but the doctor had firmly told him that husbands had no place in the birthing room. So he paced and prayed and cursed and paced some more, while Pete sat quietly in the corner, offering silent support. It was dawn when the baby finally came, the first rays of sun breaking through the storm clouds just as a lusty cry filled the house. Kade froze mid-step, his heart hammering. That was his child crying, his and Harriet's. He waited in agony for someone to come tell him if Harriet was all right, if the baby had survived, if his world was about to shatter again. Mrs. Clausen emerged, her face tired but smiling. "You have a son, Mr. O'Brien. A big, healthy boy. And your wife is doing well, considering. You can go in now." Kade didn't remember crossing the room, didn't remember opening the bedroom door. One moment he was in the kitchen, and the next he was beside the bed, looking down at Harriet's exhausted face and the tiny bundle in her arms. She was crying, but these were tears of joy, and when she looked up at him, her smile was radiant. "Meet your son," she whispered. Kade reached out with trembling hands and took the baby, marveling at how small and perfect he was. The infant had a shock of dark hair and was red-faced from crying, but to Kade, he was the most beautiful thing in the world. "He's perfect," Kade breathed. "He is," Harriet agreed. "I want to name him Samuel. It means God has heard, and I think he did hear us, Kade. He gave us this miracle." "Samuel," Kade repeated, testing the name. "Samuel O'Brien, I like it." He carefully placed the baby back in Harriet's arms and sat on the edge of the bed, wrapping his arm around his wife's shoulders. They stayed like that for a long time, the three of them together, while outside the storm began to clear, and the winter sun rose over the Montana mountains. Samuel was a healthy, happy baby who quickly became the center of their world. Kade proved to be a devoted father, walking the floor with his son during late-night crying sessions, changing diapers without complaint, and singing tuneless lullabies that somehow still soothed the baby. Harriet watched him with her son and fell in love with him all over again, deeper this time than before. But she never forgot Emma and Elijah. On what would have been their second birthday, she and Kade bundled Samuel up and walked to the cottonwood tree. There, beneath the simple wooden markers Kade had carved, they sat together and told Samuel about the brother and sister he would never know. It hurt, but it was a healing kind of hurt, an acknowledgement that they would always carry this grief alongside their joy. The years passed in the way they do on a working farm, marked by seasons and harvests and the slow accumulation of small improvements. They expanded the house, adding on 2 more bedrooms and a larger kitchen. The cattle herd grew. They bought more land. Slowly but surely, they built something solid and lasting. Samuel grew into a bright, energetic boy with his father's whiskey eyes and his mother's dark hair. When he was 3, Harriet found herself pregnant again, and this time the fear was less consuming. She'd done this once successfully. She could do it again. Their daughter Lily was born on a warm spring day in 1884, arriving so quickly that Dr. Clausen barely made it in time. She had Harriet's green eyes and Kade's stubborn chin, and she ruled the household from the moment she drew breath. 2 years later came another son, Michael, and then 2 years after that, twin girls named Rose and Ruby, who made everyone laugh by arriving exactly 9 years after Emma and Elijah. It felt like a kind of symmetry, a closing of a circle. The house that had once echoed with emptiness was now filled with noise and laughter and the chaos of children. Through it all, Kade and Harriet's love deepened and matured. They fought sometimes, as all couples do, usually about money or parenting or how to handle the ranch. But they never went to bed angry, and they never forgot what they'd built together from ashes and grief. On their 10th wedding anniversary in 1889, Kade surprised Harriet with a new rocking chair for the porch, this one carved with elaborate scrollwork and cushioned in soft fabric. It was beautiful, a far cry from the battered chair where he'd first found her, and Harriet burst into tears when she saw it. "Do you not like it?" Kade asked, worried. "I love it," she said through her tears. "But why? Why replace the old one?" "Because I want you to make new memories," he said, pulling her close. "Good ones. I want you to sit in this chair with our grandchildren someday, and tell them stories about how their grandfather was a cowboy who rode up to a farmhouse one summer day and found their grandmother rocking an empty cradle. And you sat beside me," Harriet added softly, "and asked me to tell you about them. And you did, and everything changed." She kissed him then, there on the porch with their children playing in the yard and the Montana sun warm on their faces. "Everything changed," she agreed. That evening, after the children were in bed, they sat together in the new rocking chair, Harriet on Kade's lap like they were newlyweds instead of an old married couple. They rocked slowly, listening to the night sounds and watching the stars come out. "You ever regret it?" Harriet asked quietly. Stopping here that day, marrying me, you could have had an easier life somewhere else." Cade was quiet for a moment, considering. "No," he said finally. "I don't regret a single second. You gave me purpose, Harriet. You gave me a home and a family and a reason to wake up every morning grateful to be alive. How could I regret that? Even though I came with so much baggage, so much pain, especially because of that. The pain is part of what made you who you are. It taught you empathy and strength and resilience. Without it, you wouldn't be the woman I love." He paused, then added, "Besides, I had my own baggage. We all do. The trick is finding someone who'll help you carry it." Harriet leaned her head back against his shoulder, content. "You're good at that, carrying things. So are you." They rocked in comfortable silence for a while longer until Harriet said, "Samuel asked me today about Emma and Elijah. He wanted to know if they would have liked him. What did you tell him?" "That they would have loved him. That they would have loved all their siblings, and that even though they're gone, they're still part of our family." "That's good," Cade said. "That's right. He asked if I still miss them. And I told him I'll always miss them, but that missing them doesn't mean I'm not happy. That you can hold both things at the same time, grief and joy, loss and gratitude." She twisted in his arms to look up at him. "Do you think that's true? Can you really hold both?" Cade thought about the empty cradle, about the woman he'd found rocking it, who'd been a stranger then, and was now the center of his universe. He thought about the babies buried under the cottonwood tree and the 5 healthy children sleeping in their beds. He thought about Thomas Merrick, who'd run from pain, and about himself, who'd chosen to sit down beside it. "Yes," he said finally, "I know it's true. We're living proof." The years continued their relentless march. Samuel grew tall and strong, inheriting his father's gift with cattle and his mother's head for business. Lily became a teacher, opening a small school on their property for the children of nearby ranchers. Michael wanted to be a lawyer and spent every spare moment reading law books borrowed from the judge in Deer Lodge. Rose and Ruby were still young, but they showed signs of being as strong-willed as their mother. In 1895, when Harriet was 41 and Cade was 44, they received an unexpected visitor. Thomas Merrick appeared at their door one autumn afternoon, looking old and worn despite being only 53. He'd aged badly, his handsome face lined and haggard, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. Cade answered the door and felt his jaw tighten. "Merrick, O'Brien." Thomas nodded respectfully, or as respectfully as he could manage. "I was hoping to speak with Harriet, if she's willing." Harriet appeared behind Cade, drawn by the sound of her former husband's voice. She studied him for a long moment, trying to reconcile this broken man with the charming young farmer she'd married so many years ago. "What do you want, Thomas?" "To apologize," he said simply. "I know it's 16 years too late, and I know you have no reason to hear me out, but I needed to try. I've been sober for a year now, and part of my recovery is making amends to the people I've hurt, and I hurt you terribly. Both of you." Harriet glanced at Cade, who squeezed her hand reassuringly. She could send Thomas away, and Cade would support her decision. But she thought about the woman she'd been, rocking an empty cradle, and the woman she was now, surrounded by love and family. She thought about carrying grief and joy together, about how healing sometimes required facing the painful past. "Come in," she said. They sat in the parlor, now furnished with comfortable chairs and a piano Lily was learning to play. Thomas looked around at the evidence of prosperity and happiness, and something like regret crossed his face. "You've built a good life here," he said. "We have," Harriet agreed, emphasizing the "we" slightly. "But I doubt you rode all the way out here just to observe that." "No." Thomas took a deep breath. "I wanted to say I'm sorry for leaving you when you needed me most, for blaming you for losing Emma and Elijah, for saying those terrible things at the saloon, for being a coward and a drunk and a terrible husband. He looked at Kade. And I wanted to thank you for being the man I should have been. Kade didn't respond, his face carefully neutral. I don't expect forgiveness, Thomas continued, looking back at Harriet. I know what I did was unforgivable, but I wanted you to know that I've thought about you every day for 16 years and I've regretted my actions every single one of those days. You deserved better. You deserved him. He nodded at Kade. Harriet was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, I appreciate you coming here and saying this, Thomas. I do. But you're right. You can't undo the past. What you did nearly destroyed me. If it hadn't been for Kade, I don't know if I would have survived. I know. But I'm not going to carry anger toward you anymore. It's too heavy and I've got better things to do with my energy. So yes, I forgive you. Not for your sake, but for mine. Because I want to be free of you completely, and I can't do that while I'm still angry. Thomas nodded, tears streaming down his weathered face. Thank you. That's more than I deserve. Probably, Harriet agreed without malice. Now, if you don't mind, my children will be home soon and I need to start dinner. It was a dismissal, clear and final. Thomas stood, nodded to both of them, and left. Kade and Harriet watched through the window as he mounted his horse and rode away, disappearing down the road toward town. How do you feel? Kade asked. Harriet considered. Free, she said finally. Like I just set down a burden I didn't realize I was still carrying. He pulled her into his arms and they stood there together in their parlor, surrounded by the life they'd built. I'm proud of you, he said. I learned from the best. She kissed him softly. Now come help me with dinner. Samuel's bringing that girl home again, and I want to make a good impression, Kade laughed. You always make a good impression. Life continued its sweet rhythm. Samuel married his sweetheart, a rancher's daughter named Alina, and they built a house on the far edge of the property. 2 years later, they gave Kade and Harriet their first grandchild, a little girl they named Emma. Harriet cried when she heard the name, overwhelmed by the gift of having that name spoken in her home again, this time with joy instead of grief. More grandchildren followed as the years passed. Lily married the new doctor who'd taken over Dr. Clausen's practice after the old man retired, and they had 3 children in quick succession. Michael did become a lawyer and moved to Helena, where he met and married a senator's daughter. Rose and Ruby eventually went into business together, opening a dress shop in Deer Lodge that became wildly popular. Through it all, Kade and Harriet remained the center of their expanding family. Their home became the gathering place for holidays and celebrations, always full of laughter and noise and love. They grew old together gracefully, their hair turning gray, their faces lining with the marks of years well lived. On a summer evening in 1910, 31 years after the day Kade had first ridden up to the farmhouse, they sat together in the rocking chair he'd given Harriet on their 10th anniversary. They'd worn the cushion thin with years of use, and the chair creaked a little now, but it was still solid. Like their marriage, Harriet was 65, Kade 68. They'd slowed down, letting Samuel and his sons handle most of the ranch work now, but they were still active, still engaged with the world around them. And they were still deeply in love, perhaps more so than ever, having weathered decades of joys and sorrows together. You remember the first thing you said to me? Harriet asked, her head resting comfortably on Kade's shoulder. Tell me about them, Kade said quietly. You sat beside me and you asked me to tell you about my babies. Most people would have run away. Most people wouldn't have wanted to deal with a grieving stranger, but you sat down and asked me to talk about them. It seemed like what you needed. It was exactly what I needed. You gave me permission to grieve, to remember them out loud, and then you stayed and you gave me a reason to keep living. She lifted her head to look at him. You saved my life that day, Kade O'Brien. And you gave me one, he countered. Before I found you, I was just drifting, working one ranch after another, saving money for a dream that never felt real. But you made it real. You gave me purpose and family and a home. We saved each other. She smiled, that beautiful smile that still made his heart skip after all these years. We did, didn't we? We did. They rocked in comfortable silence, watching their grandchildren play in the yard while the Montana sun painted the sky in shades of gold and pink. Emma, the oldest grandchild at 18 now, was teaching the younger ones a game, her dark hair flying as she ran. Kade and Harriet watched, their hearts full. I was thinking, Harriet said eventually, about Emma and Elijah, how they'd be 31 now if they'd lived, all grown up with families of their own probably. You still think about them often. Every day, she admitted, but differently now. Not with that raw, consuming grief from the beginning, more like a gentle ache and awareness of what might have been. Does that make sense? Perfect sense. I think they would have been happy knowing we had more children. That they have siblings and a father who loves them, even though they never got to meet him. Kade held her a little tighter. I wish I could have known them. So do I. But I'm grateful for what we have. For Samuel and Lily and Michael and Rose and Ruby. For all our grandchildren. For this life we built together, she paused. For you most of all. I love you, Harriet O'Brien. I've loved you since the day I found you rocking that empty cradle, though I didn't know it then. And I'll love you until my last breath and beyond. And I love you. My cowboy who stopped to help a grieving stranger and ended up giving her everything. They kissed then, soft and sweet, as the summer evening deepened around them. Their grandchildren's laughter drifted across the yard. Somewhere inside the house, Lily was cooking dinner and they could smell roasting chicken and fresh bread. Samuel was walking up from the barn with his sons, done with the day's work. This was their legacy: family, love, perseverance, hope. That night, after everyone had gone home or gone to bed, Kade and Harriet walked out to the cottonwood tree together. They did this often, maintaining the small graves even though Emma and Elijah had been gone for over 30 years. Tonight, they tidied the area around the markers, pulling a few weeds, straightening the stones. Thank you, Harriet said softly, addressing the tiny graves. Thank you for the time I had with you, short as it was, and thank you for leading me to your father. She glanced at Kade with a small smile. Because that's what happened, isn't it? If I hadn't lost you, I never would have been on that porch. Kade never would have stopped. We never would have found each other. It was a bittersweet thought, joy and sorrow intertwined as always. But Harriet had long since learned that this was the nature of life itself. Loss leading to gain, endings making room for new beginnings, grief and love existing side by side. They walked back to the house hand in hand, their steps slow but steady. Inside, they prepared for bed with the easy familiarity of decades together. Harriet brushed out her long gray hair while Kade pulled off his boots. They moved around each other in the bedroom like dancers who'd perfected their choreography over countless performances. In bed, they curled together as they had every night for 31 years, Harriet's back to Kade's chest, his arm around her waist. This was home, this closeness, this comfort, this certainty that whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together. Kade, Harriet murmured into the darkness. If you could go back, knowing everything you know now, would you still stop that day? He didn't even hesitate. Yes, 1,000 times yes. Every choice I've made since that day, every hardship and joy has been worth it because it meant being with you, even the hard years. When the drought nearly broke us, when Michael was so sick we thought we'd lose him, when my father died and I couldn't stop crying for weeks, especially then. Those were the times when we proved what we were made of, when we learned we could weather anything together. I wouldn't trade a single moment, Harriet, not one. She rolled over to face him, and even in the darkness, he could see the gleam of tears on her cheeks. I'm so grateful you stopped that day. So grateful you sat beside me and asked me to tell you about them. So am I, my love. So am I. They drifted off to sleep holding each other, peaceful and content. Outside, the Montana wind whispered through the cottonwood tree, carrying with it the memory of two babies who'd lived briefly, but whose loss had led to something beautiful and lasting. The empty cradle was long gone, replaced by beds and cribs that had held 5 children and were now welcoming a third generation. The farm that had nearly been lost to foreclosure was now prosperous and thriving, passed down to Samuel and his sons to continue the work. But more than any of that, the broken woman who'd been rocking that empty cradle had found healing and hope, and a love that had sustained her through 3 decades and counting. And the cowboy who'd stopped to help a stranger had found his purpose, his home, his family, his everything. Years passed in the gentle way of well-lived lives. Kade and Harriet continued on, their love story becoming legend in Deer Lodge and the surrounding area. People told the tale of the cowboy who'd married the grieving widow and built an empire with her, of the two who'd turned tragedy into triumph through sheer determination. And love. When Kade was 73 and Harriet was 70, they took a trip into town together on a crisp autumn afternoon. They were walking down Main Street, Kade's arm around Harriet's waist because her hip was bothering her, when they passed the old saloon where he'd punched Thomas Merrick so many years before. They paused, remembering. "You were so fierce that day," Harriet said with a laugh. "I'd never seen you angry before. It was rather attractive, actually." "He deserved more than one punch for what he said to you," Kade replied. "But I'm glad I only gave him one. Violence isn't the answer to most things." "No, but sometimes it's very satisfying." They continued their walk, stopping to chat with neighbors and friends, people who'd known them for decades. At the general store, the proprietor's grandson helped them load their purchases into their wagon, refusing payment for his assistance. "My grandfather told me you two gave him his start," the young man said. "Loaned him money when the bank wouldn't back in the day. We don't forget kindnesses like that." Kade and Harriet exchanged glances, barely remembering the incident. They'd helped so many people over the years, neighbors in need, young couples starting out, families hit by hard times. It was what you did when you'd been given so much. You shared it. On the ride home, Harriet was quiet, watching the familiar landscape roll by. This place that had once felt foreign and hostile now felt like the truest home she'd ever known. Every hill and valley held memories. The creek where their children had learned to swim, the meadow where they'd had countless family picnics, the ridge where she and Kade had watched the sunset on their wedding night. "What are you thinking about?" Kade asked, always attuned to her moods. "How strange life is," she said. "How you can't see the pattern until you look back. If someone had told me on that awful day, sitting with that empty cradle, that I'd end up here, I never would have believed them. I thought my life was over." "In a way it was," Kade said thoughtfully. "The life you'd planned ended that day, but a different life, a better one I hope, began. Definitely a better one." She reached over and squeezed his hand. "I got you. That winter was harsh, with blizzards that piled snow higher than anyone could remember." Kade and Harriet spent long evenings by the fire, reading or talking or simply sitting together in companionable silence. Sometimes the grandchildren came to visit, bright spots of energy and noise in the quiet house, and both Kade and Harriet delighted in their company. Spring came eventually, as it always does, and with it came new life on the ranch. Calves were born, the garden was planted, the creek ran high with snowmelt. Kade and Harriet emerged from the house like bears from hibernation, ready to engage with the world again. It was on a perfect June morning, very much like the morning of their wedding 36 years before, that Harriet found Kade in the barn. He was sitting on a hay bale, breathing hard, his hand pressed to his chest. "Kade," she was at his side immediately, fear making her voice sharp. "What's wrong?" "Just a pain," he managed. "Probably nothing. I'm getting old, Harriet. Things hurt that didn't used to." But it wasn't nothing. Dr. Morrison, Lily's husband, came out that afternoon and examined Kade thoroughly. His diagnosis was grim. Kade's heart was failing. There were treatments they could try, but at 74, with the damage already done, the prognosis wasn't good. "How long?" Harriet asked, her voice remarkably steady. "Months, maybe a year if he's careful," the doctor said gently. "I'm sorry." Harriet nodded, absorbing this information. Then she thanked the doctor, saw him out, and returned to where Kade sat in their bedroom, looking stunned. "Well," she said, sitting beside him and taking his hand, "I guess we'd better make the most of whatever time we have left." He looked at her, this woman who'd been his partner and companion for more than 3 decades, and felt his eyes burn with tears. "I don't want to leave you. I know. I don't want you to leave either, but we don't get to choose these things." She cupped his face in her hands. "What we can choose is how we spend your remaining time. Do we want to spend it mourning what's coming or celebrating what we've had?" "Celebrating," he said firmly. "Always celebrating with you," and so they did. That summer and fall were bittersweet, filled with family gatherings and quiet moments, with laughter and occasional tears. Kade grew weaker as the months passed, his strength fading like daylight at dusk, but his spirit remained strong. He made sure to tell each of his children and grandchildren how much he loved them, how proud he was of them. He worked with Samuel to ensure the ranch would continue to prosper after he was gone. He made certain Harriet would be financially secure and surrounded by family. But mostly, he spent time with his wife. They talked about their years together, reliving memories good and bad. They sat in the rocking chair on the porch, watching the Montana sky turn brilliant with autumn colors. They lay in bed at night, holding each other, saying all the things that needed to be said while there was still time. "I've had a good life," Kade told her one evening as they watched the first snow of the season fall. "Better than I ever dreamed possible. And it's all because I stopped at a farmhouse one day and found a woman who needed help." "You did more than help," Harriet said, her voice thick with tears she refused to shed yet. "You loved me. You chose me every single day. You gave me a reason to keep living, and then you made that life worth living. We did that for each other." "Yes, we did." Kade passed away on a cold December night with Harriet beside him and all their children gathered around his bed. His last words were, "I love you, Harriet." And he died with a smile on his face, at peace with his life and ready for whatever came next. Harriet held his hand until it grew cold, until the doctor gently told her it was time to let go. She kissed his forehead one last time, then stood on legs that felt like they might give out any moment. Her children surrounded her, supporting her, and together they began the painful process of saying goodbye to the man who'd been the foundation of their family. The funeral was huge, with people coming from all over Montana to pay their respects. Kade O'Brien had been loved and respected, known for his fairness, his kindness, his integrity. Stories were told of his generosity, his wisdom, his humor. But the story Harriet told, standing at his grave with the winter wind biting at her face, was the one about how they'd met. 36 years ago, she said, her voice carrying across the assembled crowd. "I was sitting on my porch rocking an empty cradle and wanting to die. My babies were gone, my husband had abandoned me, and I saw no reason to continue. Then a cowboy rode up, a stranger who had no obligation to help me, and he sat beside me. And he said, "Tell me about them." Those simple words, that simple act of compassion, changed my life. He asked me to tell him about my babies, and in doing so, he gave me permission to grieve. And then he gave me something even more precious. He gave me hope. He stayed when he could have left. He loved me when I was broken. He built a life with me when I thought life was over. Kade O'Brien was the best man I ever knew, and I'm grateful for every single day we had together. I'm grateful he stopped that day. I'm grateful he asked. I'm grateful he stayed. There wasn't a dry eye in the crowd. They buried Kade beside Emma and Elijah, under the cottonwood tree that had witnessed so much of their story. Harriet stood there long after everyone else had left, staring at the freshly turned earth, trying to comprehend that he was really gone. "I'll see you again," she whispered. "I don't know how long it'll be, but I will. And until then, I'll keep living the life we built together. I'll watch our grandchildren grow up. I'll make sure our legacy continues. I'll remember you every single day and love you just as much as I did when you were here. Rest now, my darling. You've earned it." The first months without Kade were brutally hard. Harriet found herself reaching for him in the night, forgetting for brief moments that he was gone. She'd think of something funny to tell him, then remember with a sharp pang that he wasn't there to hear it. The house felt too empty, too quiet, despite frequent visits from her children and grandchildren. But Harriet had survived grief before. She knew that the only way through it was to keep moving forward one day at a time. So she did. She helped Lily teach at the school. She spent time with her grandchildren, telling them stories about their grandfather. She worked on a quilt using scraps of fabric from clothes Kade had worn, creating something beautiful from the remnants of his life. And every evening, weather permitting, she sat in the rocking chair on the porch, the chair Kade had given her so many years ago. Sometimes she rocked the cradle that Samuel had brought down from the attic, the same cradle Kade had found her with that first day. It wasn't empty anymore, though. She'd filled it with photographs of Emma and Elijah, of Kade, of their 5 children, of all their grandchildren. A visual representation of what that empty cradle had eventually become. A family, a legacy, a love that transcended death. Harriet lived for 5 more years after Kade's death, years filled with both joy and sorrow. She saw 3 more great-grandchildren born, attended 2 more weddings, and celebrated her 75th birthday surrounded by more than 40 family members, all descendants of the love she and Kade had shared. She passed away peacefully in her sleep on a warm summer night, in the bed she'd shared with Kade for so many years. Samuel found her in the morning, a slight smile on her face, finally at rest. They buried her beside her husband and her first babies, closing the circle at last. At her funeral, Emma, the oldest grandchild, told the story of how Harriet and Kade had met. It had become a family legend, passed down and treasured, a reminder that from the darkest grief could come the brightest joy. "My grandmother used to say that love wasn't about finding someone perfect," Emma said. "It was about finding someone who'd sit beside you in your darkest moment and ask you to tell them about it. That's what my grandfather did for her, and that's what she did for him in return. They saved each other, and in doing so, they created all of us. Every person in this family exists because a cowboy stopped one day and chose kindness over convenience. Because he sat beside a grieving woman and said, 'Tell me about them.' We should all be so lucky to find that kind of love in our lives." The family gathered afterward at the ranch, which was still thriving under Samuel's management. They looked through photo albums and shared memories, laughing and crying in equal measure. And as the sun set over the Montana mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink just as it had on so many evenings before, they felt the presence of Kade and Harriet still there, woven into every board of the house, every inch of the land, every beat of their hearts. The story didn't end there, of course. Stories never really end, they just continue in different forms. Samuel's children took over the ranch eventually, and their children after them. Lily's descendants continued teaching, passing on knowledge and compassion to new generations. Michael's legal career led to changes in Montana law that helped protect family farms. Rose and Ruby's dress shop became a landmark in Deer Lodge, still operating a century later. But the story that was told most often, the one that defined the family more than any other, was the story of the cowboy and the empty cradle. It was told at weddings and christenings, at family reunions and quiet evenings around the fire. It was told to remind them where they came from, what they were built on. Love and compassion, resilience and hope, the choice to stay when leaving would have been easier. And somewhere, in whatever realm exists beyond this one, Kade and Harriet were together again, finally reunited after their brief separation. They were with Emma and Elijah, the babies they'd lost who'd led them to each other. And they were watching over the family they'd created, the legacy they'd built from tragedy and determination, and a love that had proven stronger than death itself. The empty cradle had been filled, over and over again. And it all started with a simple act of kindness. A cowboy sitting beside a grieving woman and asking her to tell him about her babies. From that moment, everything changed. Two broken people found each other and built something beautiful. And that, ultimately, is what love is. The choice to sit beside someone in their pain, to ask them to share it, and then to stay and help them carry it. Kade and Harriet had done that for each other, and in doing so, they'd created a love story that would be remembered for generations to come. A testament to the power of compassion, the resilience of the human spirit, and the transformative nature of true love.